How the German POWs reacted when they saw America for the first time. This can't be America! The year was 1943. Across the brutal battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, the tide of World War II was slowly, inexorably turning against the Axis powers. For many young German soldiers, who had once marched with the proud conviction of inevitable victory, the reality was now one of grinding attrition, desperate retreats, and ultimately capture. These men, barely out of their teens for the most part, had known little else but the rigid discipline of military life and the escalating deprivation of a nation at war. Their homeland, Germany, was increasingly scarred by Allied bombing raids, its cities crumbling, its population rationing every scrap of food and fuel. Life was a constant struggle for survival, a grim existence overshadowed by the specter of death and destruction. Victory parades and grand pronouncements had long since given way to the stark reality of a war that was devouring their youth, their resources, and their future. When they surrendered, often after days or weeks of relentless fighting with dwindling supplies, a new kind of uncertainty began. They were no longer soldiers fighting for the fatherland, but prisoners of war, their fates now entirely in the hands of their enemies, the very nations they had been taught to despise and conquer. For the thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers captured by American forces, a long and bewildering journey lay ahead. They were rounded up, processed, and then, in convoys under heavy guard, transported to port cities. The destination was often kept secret, fueling rumors and anxieties among the ranks. Many speculated about harsh internment camps in Britain, or even worse, the Soviet Union, a place of legendary brutality. The thought of crossing the vast Atlantic Ocean seemed almost unfathomable, a journey into the unknown depths of enemy territory. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic were often repurposed troop transports, crammed with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of German prisoners. Below decks, conditions were Spartan, to say the least. Hammocks were slung close together in dimly lit holds, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the omnipresent scent of the sea. Days blurred into weeks. The rhythmic thrum of the engines, the constant roll and pitch of the vessel, and the monotonous routine of meals and limited exercise became their new reality. Conversations were hushed, often dwelling on their families back home, the wives and children they had left behind in a war-torn land, unsure if they would ever see them again. Hope mingled with despair, and fear was a constant companion. What awaited them in America? What kind of country was this distant foe? A nation they knew almost exclusively through their own state's propaganda. That propaganda had painted a picture of a decadent, materialistic society, perhaps technologically advanced, but certainly not one to be admired or feared in the same way as the formidable Soviet Union or the ancient British Empire. They expected a functional, industrialized nation, but one surely suffering from the immense strain of a global conflict, just as Europe was. Their understanding of America was largely a composite of carefully curated government information, pre-war newsreels, and the occasional distorted anecdote. They knew of Hollywood, jazz music, and enormous factories, but these were abstract concepts, filtered through an enemy lens. They had been told of a land of immigrants, a melting pot, but also a nation soft and unaccustomed to true hardship. They certainly did not expect a land untouched by the horrors that had ravaged their own continent. They envisioned a country perhaps facing rationing, blackout drills, and the visible scars of a war machine operating at full throttle. They imagined a landscape perhaps dotted with military installations, but surely not a land of pristine, unblemished prosperity. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the first whispers began to circulate through the crowded holds. Land! A ripple of excitement, tinged with apprehension, swept through the prisoners. They pressed against portholes, craned their necks, or waited for their turn on deck, eager for a first glimpse of this enigmatic adversary. What they saw as their ships began to navigate the coastal waters, drawing closer to the American mainland, defied every expectation, every piece of propaganda, every grim assumption they had held. The initial sights were bewildering. Instead of a war-torn coastline, they saw vast, green expanses of land, untouched forests stretching to the horizon, and clean, unblemished beaches. There were no bombed-out factories, no visible signs of wartime destruction, no cities shrouded in smoke or darkness. The sheer scale of the landscape was breathtaking, far grander than anything they had ever encountered in compact, densely populated Europe. As the ships drew nearer to major port cities, like New York or Boston, the visual assault on their senses intensified. What rose before their eyes was a panorama of staggering modernity and unimaginable wealth. Towering skyscrapers, gleaming in the sunlight, pierced the sky with an audacious confidence. These were not the Gothic cathedrals or ancient castles of Europe, nor the functional, often grim, industrial structures of their own wartime Germany. These were monuments to commerce and innovation, built on a scale that dwarfed anything they had ever conceived. The harbors were bustling, not with military vessels exclusively, but with a vibrant array of merchant ships, tugboats, and ferries, all moving with an air of normalcy that was utterly foreign to men who had lived under the shadow of U-boat warfare and constant naval threat. The docks themselves were hives of activity, not desperate wartime efforts, but a seemingly endless flow of goods and resources. Cranes swung massive loads with ease, trucks rumbled, and trains shunted, all pointing to an economy that was not merely functioning, but thriving, flourishing beyond anything they could comprehend. The most profound shock, however, came from the details, the myriad small observations that collectively painted a picture of a nation utterly untouched by the war that had consumed their world. They saw cars, not just a few, but thousands, flowing smoothly along wide, uncracked roads. These were not the patched-up, rationed vehicles of wartime Germany, running on wood gas or barely functioning on scarce fuel, but sleek, modern automobiles, seemingly in endless supply. The buildings lining the streets were intact, their windows unbroken, their facades clean, without a single bullet hole or bomb crater in sight. The people they glimpsed on the streets, civilians going about their daily lives, were well-dressed, seemingly well-fed, and moved with a casual ease that spoke of peace and plenty. There were no uniforms everywhere, no grim faces reflecting constant anxiety, no visible signs of hunger or deprivation. Fresh fruits and vegetables, meat, coffee, sugar, items that had become rare luxuries or even mythical in Germany, were openly displayed in markets and stores, a riot of color and abundance. This was not the America they had been told about. This was not a nation struggling, or even merely coping, with the demands of a global war. This was a land of staggering, almost offensive prosperity. A murmur spread through the ranks, a shared sense of disbelief, articulated in hushed, incredulous tones. "This can't be America," many whispered, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound, unsettling confusion. "This simply cannot be America." Their entire worldview, shaped by years of propaganda and the brutal realities of war, was crumbling before their very eyes. The sheer, unadulterated normalcy of it all was the most shocking aspect, a stark, almost cruel, contrast to the devastation they had left behind. They had expected a powerful enemy, yes, but one scarred by conflict, not this seemingly idyllic paradise of untouched wealth and boundless resources. The implications of what they were witnessing began to sink in, slowly, painfully. If this was America, then the war they were fighting, the war they had lost, was perhaps unwinnable from the start. They had been fighting a phantom, an enemy whose true strength and resilience they had utterly failed to comprehend. The ships eventually docked, not in the chaos of a war zone, but with an almost mundane efficiency that only added to the prisoners' bewilderment. Gangplanks were lowered, and the German soldiers, now merely numbers in a vast logistical operation, were herded off the vessels. Their legs, accustomed to the constant roll of the sea, felt unsteady on solid ground, an alien sensation in this alien land. The air was different here too, crisp and clean, devoid of the familiar scent of coal smoke, damp earth, and distant explosions that had defined their lives for years. Instead, a peculiar mix of salt air and an undefinable sweetness, perhaps from distant factories or the sheer vitality of the city, filled their lungs. American guards, tall and seemingly well-fed, guided them with firm but not overtly brutal commands. Their uniforms were clean, their boots shined, a stark contrast to the often grimy, battle-worn appearance of the German troops who had surrendered. There was no visible hatred in the guards' eyes, only a professional detachment, an almost indifferent efficiency that unnerved many of the prisoners more than open hostility might have. They were simply a task, a problem to be managed. The sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming. Thousands of German prisoners were being processed, yet there was no discernible bottleneck, no frantic scramble. Everything moved with a methodical, almost effortless rhythm. They were lined up, counted, their names checked against manifests, their few remaining personal effects confiscated, though often returned later. What struck many was the abundance of resources dedicated to their processing. Trucks and jeeps, all seemingly new and in perfect working order, moved ceaselessly. Barracks, freshly painted and well-maintained, stood ready to house them temporarily. Even the food they were given, simple sandwiches and lukewarm coffee, was of a quality and quantity that many had not seen in years. It was not a feast, but it was sustenance, provided without a hint of scarcity. This was not the lean, desperate enemy they had been led to expect. This was a giant, flexing its logistical muscles with casual ease, even for its captured foes. The journey inland began shortly after. Packed into long trains with barred windows, they were transported deeper into the heart of America. The trains themselves were a marvel of engineering to men who had seen their own railway systems crippled by bombing and constant use. These carriages were sturdy, comfortable even, and the engines pulled them with a powerful, unwavering momentum. As the trains rumbled across the vast continent, the landscape outside the windows continued to defy their expectations. Hour after hour, day after day, they saw endless stretches of cultivated farmland, verdant and rich, producing food on a scale that dwarfed Europe's war-ravaged fields. Forests, ancient and untouched, stretched for miles, teeming with resources. Rivers, wide and majestic, flowed unimpeded by the scars of industry or conflict. They passed through countless towns and cities, each one a fresh assault on their preconceived notions. There were no blackouts here, no signs of rationing. Lights blazed in homes and businesses, even at night, an almost decadent display of energy in a world where every what was precious. Cars, countless automobiles, moved freely on wide, perfectly paved roads, their tires seemingly endless. Children played in parks, laughing and carefree, untouched by the fear of air raids or the grim realities of conscription. Women, dressed in vibrant colors, walked with a confident stride, their faces unlined by worry or hunger. The shops they glimpsed through the train windows were overflowing with goods, clothing, household items, and most shockingly, food. Piles of fresh bread, mountains of meat, pyramids of fruit and vegetables. It was a cornucopia, a visual feast that made their stomachs clench with a mixture of longing and profound despair. This was not a nation at war. This was a nation living in a dream of prosperity and peace, even as its sons fought on distant battlefields. The guards, who accompanied them on the trains, were mostly young, often not much older than themselves. They exchanged few words, but their presence was constant, a reminder of their captivity. Sometimes, as the train paused at a station, curious American civilians would gather, their faces a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and sometimes a flash of genuine animosity. A few children might wave, quickly pulled away by their parents. Mostly, however, they were met with an unnerving indifference. They were not hated monsters, but simply an inconvenience, a distant problem brought temporarily closer. This lack of rabid hatred, this casual acceptance of their presence, was another unexpected blow. It suggested a confidence, an unshakable belief in their own victory that superseded any need for emotional displays. The destinations were scattered across the American heartland, far from the coasts, far from the psychological comfort of the sea. For many, the journey lasted days, sometimes weeks, a slow, grinding realization of the sheer size and untouched nature of their enemy's homeland. Finally, their train would halt in a desolate, often rural area, and they would be marched through dusty roads to their new homes, the prisoner of war camps. These camps, often hastily constructed but remarkably functional, were a world unto themselves. Barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and armed guards were omnipresent, a clear demarcation of their status. Yet, within these confines, another layer of shock began to unfold. The barracks were simple but sturdy, providing shelter from the elements. Bunk beds, blankets, and even rudimentary personal hygiene items were provided. The food, while monotonous, was plentiful and nutritious. 3 meals a day, often featuring meat, fresh vegetables, and bread. Coffee, a luxury almost forgotten in Germany, was a regular staple. Compared to the meager rations and constant hunger they had endured in the trenches, or the increasingly desperate conditions back home, it was a banquet. Many prisoners, initially suspicious, found themselves gaining weight, their gaunt faces slowly filling out. This physical improvement, however, came with a heavy psychological price. The comparative comfort of the camps fueled internal conflicts among the prisoners. The most ardent Nazis, those still clinging to the belief in the fatherland's ultimate victory and the superiority of their ideology, found themselves increasingly isolated. They tried to maintain discipline, to enforce the party line, to spread rumors of German counteroffensives and imminent victory. But the evidence of their eyes, the undeniable reality of American prosperity, made their words ring hollow. How could Germany win against such an enemy? An enemy that could feed its prisoners better than its own citizens? An enemy whose homeland was untouched by the war they had started? Whispers turned into open arguments. Men who had once been comrades in arms now glared at each other across the mess hall tables. Some expressed their disillusionment openly, questioning the propaganda they had been fed, the sacrifices they had made. Others, exhausted and broken by the war, simply embraced the relative peace and sustenance, their will to fight or even to believe eroded by the stark contrast between their past and present. A deep sense of betrayal began to fester in many hearts. They had been told of a weak, decadent America, a nation incapable of truly fighting a modern war. They had been told of a shared struggle, of a Europe united against a common foe. Now, they saw the truth, a formidable, wealthy power that had barely begun to feel the pinch of conflict, a nation whose resources seemed limitless. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Every hot meal, every new pair of shoes, every clean bunk was a stark reminder of their defeat, not just on the battlefield, but in the grand narrative they had been taught. The war, which had consumed their youth and their nation, was for America merely a distant enterprise, a problem to be solved with overwhelming force and seemingly endless resources. The psychological impact was profound. Many struggled with a crushing sense of futility, a dawning horror at what awaited their families back home. If America was this strong, if Germany was truly so isolated and outmatched, then the devastation they had left behind was only a prelude to a far greater catastrophe. The future, once a clear path of duty and eventual victory, now stretched before them as a vast, uncertain abyss, filled with the ghosts of their shattered beliefs and the looming specter of a world utterly transformed. They were not merely prisoners of war. They were unwilling witnesses to the true power of their adversary, and the implications of that power were slowly, inexorably, beginning to reshape their very souls. The conflict was no longer just between nations. It was raging within each man, a brutal battle between ingrained dogma and undeniable truth. The days in the American prisoner of war camp settled into a monotonous rhythm, yet beneath the surface of routine, a profound internal battle raged. For many German soldiers, the initial shock of America's untouched prosperity slowly gave way to a more insidious form of disillusionment. The propaganda they had ingested for years, portraying America as a decadent, soft, and ultimately fragile nation, was not merely disproven. It was utterly obliterated by the daily evidence of their new reality. They ate regular, substantial meals, often including fresh meat and vegetables, luxuries unheard of in wartime Germany. They slept in sturdy barracks, wore clean clothes, and had access to basic medical care. This level of comfort, while still captivity, was a stark, almost cruel, contrast to the deprivation and constant threat of death they had faced on the front lines and knew their families were enduring back home. The internal divisions within the camp sharpened. The most ardent Nazis, often older non-commissioned officers, or those deeply indoctrinated by the party, clung desperately to their ideology. They held secret meetings, tried to enforce a semblance of military discipline, and spread rumors of V-weapons, wonder weapons, or a secret German counteroffensive that would turn the tide. They spoke of imminent victory, of a glorious return to the fatherland. But their voices grew weaker, their arguments less convincing, against the backdrop of American abundance. Younger soldiers, many of whom had been conscripted directly from school or farms, found their faith in the Nazi regime eroding daily. They saw the endless American resources, the calm confidence of their guards, and the sheer scale of the nation around them. How could a country that could so effortlessly feed and house thousands of its enemies be facing defeat? The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken by many, but echoing in every mind. Sometimes, prisoners were assigned to work details outside the camp, often on farms or in local industries, filling labor shortages created by American men fighting overseas. These excursions provided even more direct exposure to American life. They saw vast fields of corn and wheat stretching for miles, tended by modern machinery. They observed American women driving tractors, managing businesses, and contributing to the war effort with a quiet determination that belied the propaganda's image of a soft enemy. They saw small towns where life seemed to continue almost normally, with children playing, shops open, and families gathered for social events. The sight of fully stocked grocery stores, brimming with fresh produce, canned goods, and meat, was particularly jarring. It was a sensory overload, a kaleidoscope of plenty that made their stomachs ache with a mixture of longing and a deep, unsettling sense of betrayal. They had been told of a world united in suffering, but America was clearly not part of that suffering. The American guards, for the most part, maintained a professional distance. There was little overt cruelty, but also little camaraderie. They were jailers, not friends. Yet, even in their detachment, the guards conveyed a certain ease, an absence of the tension and fear that had permeated every aspect of life in Germany. Their uniforms were well maintained, their equipment functional, their demeanor calm. They were not fighting for survival. They were managing a logistical problem, a testament to the immense organizational capacity of their nation. This quiet efficiency, more than any grand display of power, spoke volumes. As the war in Europe drew to its inevitable conclusion, news trickled into the camps, piecemeal at first, then in a devastating torrent. The fall of Berlin, Hitler's death, the unconditional surrender. The reaction was a complex tapestry of emotions. For the fanatical few, it was a moment of profound despair and disbelief, a catastrophic betrayal. Some wept openly, others retreated into a stony silence, their world utterly shattered. But for the majority, the news brought a strange, almost overwhelming sense of relief. The war was over. The fighting had stopped. The constant fear, the gnawing anxiety for their families, the burden of a lost cause, all of it was lifted, replaced by a weary exhaustion and a hesitant, fragile hope for the future. There was also a quiet, grim vindication for those who had seen the truth months earlier. Their initial, incredulous whispers of, "This can't be America," had evolved into a stark understanding of their own nation's fundamental miscalculation. After V-Day, the purpose of the camp shifted. The immediate threat was gone, but the logistical challenge of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners remained. The Americans, with their characteristic efficiency, began the process of denazification. Educational programs were introduced, offering classes on democracy, history, and the true nature of the Nazi regime. While not all prisoners embraced these lessons, many, especially the younger ones, were receptive. They had seen a different world, a functioning democracy, a society of abundance, and it offered a stark contrast to the totalitarian ideology that had led their nation to ruin. They began to question everything they had been taught, to dismantle the carefully constructed edifice of propaganda that had defined their youth. The journey home, when it finally came, was a reversal of their initial voyage. Once again, they boarded ships, but this time, the anticipation was different. There was no longer the fear of the unknown enemy, but a profound anxiety about what awaited them in the fatherland. They had seen America, a nation untouched by the bombs and the battles, a land of seeming endless plenty. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that Germany would be nothing like that. As their ships approached the ravaged coastlines of post-war Europe, the sight was a brutal confirmation of their worst fears. The green landscapes of America were replaced by a grim panorama of rubble and ruin. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of culture and industry were now skeletal remains, bombed-out husks against a scarred sky. The air, once filled with the fresh scent of the American coast, now carried the acrid smell of burnt masonry, damp earth, and despair. The people they saw on the docks were thin, worn, their faces etched with years of hardship and loss. There were no gleaming cars, no bustling markets overflowing with food, no carefree children playing in parks. Instead, there was a desperate scramble for survival, a landscape of scarcity and destruction. The contrast was so profound, so devastating, that it rendered many speechless. The memory of American prosperity, of its untouched cities and endless resources, burned in their minds like a phantom limb. They had left a Germany striving for victory, and returned to a Germany utterly defeated, physically and spiritually broken. The phrase, "This can't be America," now echoed with a different, more tragic meaning. This is Germany, and it is nothing like America. Their experiences in America, however, had indelibly changed them. They returned not as the blindly obedient soldiers who had left, but as men who had witnessed an alternative, who had seen the true strength of their adversary, and who understood the devastating cost of the lies they had been fed. For many, this first-hand understanding became a crucial catalyst in the monumental task of rebuilding. They carried with them not just the trauma of war, but also a new perspective, a realization of what a stable, prosperous, and democratic society could achieve. They had seen a nation that, despite its own internal flaws, had harnessed its immense resources and the spirit of its people to overcome a global threat without succumbing to the devastation that had consumed their own land. In the years and decades that followed, these former prisoners of war, now civilians, became quiet agents of change. They helped rebuild their shattered communities, often advocating for a more democratic and peaceful future. The memory of America, the land that had so profoundly defied their expectations, served as both a bitter reminder of their defeat and a powerful inspiration for what Germany could become. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, the true cost of unchecked ambition and the immense power of a nation united, not by fear or propaganda, but by a resilient spirit and abundant resources. Their journey to America, initially a terrifying voyage into the unknown, had ultimately become a profound, if unwelcome, education, reshaping their understanding of the world and their place within it, long after the last echoes of the war had faded.